the time.
Great. I love that thing. Yeah. That's the origin of the universe.
Should we do a sound check with those 4 people? Okay, there are a few people on and we need to do a sound check. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Pam Carr's on.
Pam Carr, can you hear me okay?
Jennifer Crispin.
Jennifer Crispin, hi. Have they said anything?
Kevin Bolin said yes.
Oh, great. Okay, good. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. We're waiting to let some people get on.
Cousin Susan.
Well, I mean... Okay, we're ready to go live. I want to welcome everybody to this first Facebook Live that's sponsored by Five Rivers Historic Preservation, Inc. And it may or may not work out. So you're going to have to kind of let us know in the comments, but please try to be nice if it's not working out and you're trying to tell us that. But our preservation group is going to start having these Facebook Lives to give you tours around town. We're going to see people, we're going to see places, we're going to try to go in some houses. But we thought the best place to start would be right here at the cemetery because of how beautiful it is. I mean, I know you all have driven by here and seen how pretty it is this year, and so that's just great. So this is where we're going to start. The series is called Pocahontas Is, and Pocahontas is a whole lot of things. No comment from the peanut gallery there, but this week Pocahontas is Tales from the Crypt, or really Tales from the Cemetery, and we're going to tell you the story of 3 real interesting early families here. Some of which
says you look good.
I'd never even heard of until now, but I did a whole bunch of research on it. And I've mentioned to you who the sponsor is. I want to tell you about the staff. Okay, the staff for the Facebook Live, me, Linda Bowlin, and I was a previous officer and one of the founding members of our historic preservation group. The cameraman is John Allen French, and he's an officer. He's an officer in the preservation group. And the producer is Allison Schachtel, and we're distancing, and she is an officer in the preservation group. And then we have a little bit of a peanut gallery too. But anyway, that's who the staff is. And I want to say to you, please, first of all, if you're interested in history, I want you to join Five Rivers Historic Preservation, Inc. because we have a lot of fun and we try to do good things for this town. So contact me or contact this group or whatever if you want to join and you're interested in history, or if you even have any suggestions about things that we can do to visit.
Miss Dina says your hair looks gorgeous.
Also, feel free to ask questions or make comments on here, and I may or may not know the answers. So anyway, feel free to do that.
We'll make them up.
Now I have some suggestions and demands from the cameraman. No close-ups, John Allen, and no profile views, John Allen, period. Okay, great. And you told me to tell something else, and I forgot what it was.
Like the Facebook page.
Oh, now we're doing this on John Allen's Facebook page now because he has a lot more, his is more active than anybody else's in town. But we now have a Facebook page for Five Rivers Historic Preservation, Inc. Please go there and like it, and eventually we'll start putting some of these on there. The other thing to say is, if anybody misses this, we're going to have it posted on the other pages, on any related to the museum and Five Rivers Historic Preservation. So, let's get started. Here we are at the Masonic Cemetery in Pocahontas, Arkansas.
Which looks wonderful.
This officially became a cemetery in 1859 when 5 acres were donated by W.H. Waddle. Now, W.H. Waddle, we're going to talk about later because he's buried way down there. So we're going to talk about him later. The early burials here. Now there's some legends about them, but there's also some early tombstones. The earliest tombstone was a man who died in 1856. Well, that's 3 years before the cemetery became a cemetery. Then there's a woman who died in 1857. And that's 2 years before this became an official cemetery. But I guess people could be buried here anyway. So, the legends. The legends are, some people have told that the first person buried here was a little gypsy girl. We used to have bands of gypsies who traveled through this county and through all over the state way back in the early part of the century, and also even as recently as when I was a little girl. And when I was a little girl, they would camp there behind the Hillcrest Motel. But anyway, there's still a lot of camping there. But anyway, so a little gypsy girl may have died as her family was traveling through here, and she may be the first person buried here. Another legend is, if you walk this way, another legend is that there's a French trapper buried here. Well, as you know, the French owned this ground, and the Spanish owned this ground well before the Louisiana Purchase. And French people came through here. So one legend is there's a French trapper buried here, and supposedly the French trapper is buried under this concrete slab. Can you see it?
They said you're going to need a megaphone. A lot louder.
Okay, now my question is, how did the French trapper get a concrete slab? But anyway, that's the legend, that there's a French trapper under this slab. And one more legend, and this is really interesting, there's a part of this cemetery, not up here, but way over there somewhere, where when they dig, the earth is black, and it's very, very unusually black. And there are some people who believe that there were mass graves here. Now, that would not be that out of the question, because during the Civil War, there were 10,000 Confederate troops and then later Union troops here. But it was not a battleground. It was a place where it was a training ground, and it was also a staging area and a training area for the Confederate soldiers. And they had a measles epidemic that went through the camp, and hundreds of men died. So there may very well be a mass grave here that is the Confederate soldiers. Now, of course, considering some of our notorious history, there could be a mass grave here of murder victims too, but I kind of doubt that.
Too soon.
Civil War. But...
So anyway, there may or may not be a mass grave here. Today we're going to be talking about, well, let me back up. This cemetery is one of almost 162 cemeteries in Randolph County, and I believe it to be the largest cemetery. Let me sit over this way. I think it's the largest cemetery in Randolph County, although the Maynard Cemetery is pretty big too. But anyway, this cemetery contains a number of our well-known early people, early settlers, businessmen, farmers, politicians, county officials, who helped make Pocahontas and Randolph County a place of distinction and importance to early Arkansas. And it was, in fact, a place of distinction and importance early on. And, of course, it still is. Anyway, tonight we're going to discuss 3 of those early families. We're going to discuss the Kiblers, the Schoonovers, and the Bolins. And it's not this Bolin, it's B-O-L-E-N, and I'll tell you about it later. Now, let me have this. These families, these early families, in particular the Kiblers, who I'm going to tell you about in a minute, they all married each other, and they all named each other the same names, and the family names and all that. and it is so confusing to do research. And I just wanted to show you the family tree that I devised, which is kind of messy, but this presentation required this kind of family tree. I mean, it's crazy, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So let's go over to see the first family, the Kibler family.
Miss Bowlin.
Getting up there is better. I think it probably is because the sun won't be in my face. Okay. Okay. Here lies. Gotta turn the page. I've got to bring notes because I don't know. Here lies Adolphus and Mary Kibler. Now, I'd never heard of the Kibler. I never even heard the Kibler name. You should stand over there, that'd be better. Because the sun's in my face. I never even heard the Kibler name until we dedicated the memorial to Schoonover down at City Hall, and his middle name is Kibler. Well, now I know why, and I'll explain to you all why later. But at any rate, this is the Kibler family. These two, oh, and it's not Kibler. Kiblers were elves who made cookies. This is Kibler. Okay. They were very important to our early history because they were prolific multipliers. I'm going to need my page there. Prolific multipliers. Their daughters and nieces, and they had many of them, and their granddaughters, married practically everybody in town. Names that we all know. They married the Waddles, the Hamills, the Witts, the Schoonovers, the Blacks, the Crosbys, and just about everybody else. And it's not just me saying that. I have here the obituary of a Kibler daughter-in-law, and it says here that her husband was the son of this guy, Adolphus Kibler, who was the county treasurer for a number of years. The Kibler family in the early years largely made up the bone and sinew and intelligence of this section. The descendants of this family are now known by the hundreds. And that's the truth. You just wait as we do some more cemetery shows. The Kiblers are going to be popping up everywhere. Okay, here we go. I'll need a second. Mr. and Mrs. Kibler were both from North Carolina. And Mr. Kibler's father, oddly, was born in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was born as his parents were migrating here right after the Revolutionary War, and they came from Holland. And I find that very fascinating. I've never, well, I don't know him, but I've never even thought about somebody being born in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I'd be curious to see what his birth certificate said, if he had one. The Kiblers came here with 5 or 6 of their children in 1856, right when Pocahontas received its charter from the state of Arkansas. Now, we were a town here called Pocahontas from way back in the 30s. Before that, we were Bettis Bluff. But they came here right after we received our charter right before in 1856. And I want to tell you a little bit about their trip here. After much planning and many visits and goodbyes to relatives and friends, Mr. and Mrs. Kibler and their 4 young daughters, although they ended up with more than that, and his mother and several slaves formed a caravan of covered wagons for their carriage for the western journey westward. It was a long journey for horse-drawn vehicles, but they enjoyed it. The weather was fine, and they stopped often to camp or to fish or to hunt for their food, and if they were camped nearby a church on Sundays, they would all attend services at that church. They crossed the Mississippi River at Cape Girardeau, and they traveled what is known as the Military Road, and you all know that the Military Road comes through Randolph County, and they passed through Lindsayville, up by Maynard, they passed through the Jarrett community, and then they crossed the forest, then they crossed the Forshee River at what is known as Foster Ford, and they paused to look around, which I think is a fine statement. Well, they ended up owning property at what is now Bellevue Road out there, and they owned 320 acres, and as we said before, Mr. Kibler was active in local politics, and at one point he worked for the federal government as the IRS commissioner, and they became just real active in town. Okay, Mr. Kibler had 4 brothers. One of them was the doctor named Mary because it was so beautiful, even though it is. I think they stopped here because his daughter Marion had already set up a medical practice 3 years earlier in Water Valley. Now, who would think that Water Valley had a doctor with a medical practice? But at any rate, he did, and that was a Kibler brother, Marion Kibler. Also, Kibler had 3 other brothers. Kibler had 3 other brothers. All 4 of them served in the Civil War. This guy served at Pea Ridge. His brother Marion was a doctor in the war. His brother William was a doctor in the war, and his brother Miles was killed in the war. His brother William, this gets to the big family part. His brother William was injured in Franklin, Tennessee, and right after that, right after the war, he died, and then his wife died, and they had 5 daughters that they all sent here to live with these Kiblers. So as I said before, these Kiblers had something like 10 girls that they raised and 1 son. Now, the Kiblers were medical people. I mean, there were a whole lot of doctors in their family, as I mentioned before, but Mrs. Kibler's brother was a very famous doctor who practiced medicine in around 1809, 1810, and later in Danville, Kentucky. Now, you may say that's very remote from here, and it is, but the interesting part about it is Dr. Mcdowell, was his name in Danville, Kentucky, is known as the father of ovariectomies.
Yes.
He performed the world's first ovary removal from anybody, and I read it in some literature that was here, talking about Mary. So I thought, well, that's goofy to call him the father. It is goofy, kind of, to call him the father of ovariectomies, but I thought I'd Google him. Well, I Googled him, and sure enough, in Danville, Kentucky, there is a museum and a monument at the site of where the first ovary in the world was removed. So, it's an interesting story, and I want to read you about it, and if you're ever in Danville, Kentucky, I want you to go to the
Ovary statue.
to the Mcdowell Museum on the site. It was December of 1809, and Mcdowell was called to see a woman named Jane Todd Crawford in Greene County, Kentucky, that was 60 miles away from Danville. Her doctors thought that she was over-pregnant, that she was more than 9 months pregnant because she'd gotten so large. Well, Mcdowell came to see her out on a consult, and he diagnosed an ovarian tumor. She begged him to keep her from a slow and painful death. He then described her condition to her and told her that the operation would be very, very dangerous and had never been performed anywhere in the world. So she wanted to do it. She wanted to do it, so she agreed, and he said, I'll do it if you'll come to Danville, and she, in that condition, rode a horse 60 miles to Danville. So, on Christmas morning in 1809, Mcdowell started his operation. The surgery was performed without the benefit of anesthesia or antibiotics, neither of which was known to the medical community at the time, and he removed a tumor weighing 22.5 pounds. The whole procedure took 25 minutes.
That's an ovary.
She made an uncomplicated recovery, and she returned to her home and lived another 32 years. And he is the, did I say the king? He's the
Father.
He's the father of ovariectomies, and that's Miss Kibler's uncle. Well, not to be outdone, I mentioned earlier that Mr. Kibler's brother, Marion Kibler, who practiced in Water Valley, prior to that had practiced in the state of Alabama, practiced medicine. And he's the first doctor in Alabama and many of the southern states to use chloroform as an anesthetic. And that was a breakthrough. So there's 2 big medical breakthroughs already in this family. Now, let's move on over here. This is one of the Kibler daughters, Hattie, and she married a Dr. Crosby, who practiced in Randolph County and Pocahontas and was very well respected and well known. And she and her husband, Dr. Crosby, I'm standing on their graves right now. They're buried right here. This daughter, Mary Alice Kibler, can't see it because of the sun? You can see it? Okay. This daughter, Mary Alice, married a Dr. Wise, see, W-Y-S-E, from Greene County. Now, Dr. Wise was a very prominent, Anyway, Dr. Wise practiced in Gainesville, but then here came the railroad and everybody moved from Gainesville to Paragould, so he went to Paragould to practice medicine. I don't think, and I can't find any big medical breakthroughs for Dr. Wise, but what I can tell you is he was a good Methodist. The education hall at First Methodist Church there was either dedicated to him or there's a plaque dedicated to him in Paragould, if it's still there, at the Methodist Church in Paragould. Now, oddly, Mary Alice is buried right here, but her husband, Dr. Wise, is buried in that big old cemetery over in Paragould on Kings Highway. Now, before I move on, I want to talk about epitaphs. And as you know, epitaphs are inscriptions that are carved on monuments, and generally they're words of praise about the deceased, or they might have some religious text, or they might even have an admonishment or a curse or something. But the Kiblers have some real nice epitaphs that I want to read, and one of them in particular. So let's move over here and see if you can see them. The other thing about these epitaphs is these are a few of them that you can read. Mr. Kibler says, his many virtues form the noblest monument to his memory. Okay, well that's pretty nice. But Mary's epitaph I love, and you can come around here and read it. See, I have somewhat of a nautical background, and hers says, safely anchored in the harbor of eternal rest. And I just love that. That is so comforting. So when you go to cemeteries, read some of the epitaphs, because some of them are good, and some of them are scary, and some of them are just kind of, you know, blah. But I love this one. Now, this stone is an obelisk. It's a small obelisk. And the two daughters and the granddaughter have obelisks and or columns as a form of grave marker. Now, let's move over to the Schoonover. Sorry for this pause. Oh, go get a Coke. Get up, go get a Coke or something, or go to the bathroom while we're going to the Schoonovers. Run. Okay, there you go. Can you see him? Eugene G. Schoonover, and he was a lawyer who practiced here, along with his brother Jacob or Jake Schoonover, back in the early 1940s and 1950s in that era. And I think their office, I'm pretty sure their office was in the old State Bank building at the square. Okay, here's his wife, Estelle Waddle Schoonover, and she was a Kibler. She was the granddaughter of the Kiblers who we just talked about. So there you go. That's one of those connections from that family tree that I had to do. But what these people are really famous for, and most of you already know this. Where should I stand? Here?
I don't know.
How about here? Okay. What most of you already know this is these are the parents of Weir Kibler Schoonover, who is our favorite son in the field of athletics for Pocahontas. As you know, he was raised here by his parents. He went to the University of Arkansas, where he lettered in 4 sports. He was the first All-American football player from Arkansas, from the university or any other college in Arkansas. And he was the first All-American in the Southwest Conference. And he still holds many of the athletic records in that sport at U of A. Now, as I told you before, the first time I heard the word Kibler was when we dedicated the monument to him, or the marker to him, down in front of City Hall. And some people said, oh, why did you put it in front of City Hall? That's ridiculous. Well, we put it in front of City Hall because their house and his childhood home stood right there where City Hall is, and they tore it down to build City Hall.
Tore it down.
But anyway,
Just like the art building.
that's Now, to finish up the story about Will Schoonover, he stayed on at the U of A. He went to law school. He came back here briefly and practiced with his father and his uncle. And then he went to Washington, D.C. and practiced in the Department of Agriculture until his death in about 1980. He's buried in Arlington, but not Arlington Cemetery. He's buried in Arlington, Virginia, in the Churchyard Cemetery of the Methodist Church there. And how do we know that? We know that because his daughter Martha came here for the dedication. Yes, she's John Allen's friend.
And we're good Methodists.
And we're all good Methodists. She came here for the
Us here.
dedication of the marker to Weir Schoonover down at City Hall. And she told us that. And then the other way we know it is she goes to church with Kay McFall's daughter to the same church in Arlington, Virginia. So that's kind of odd. Now, let's move on to Mr. Schoonover's father, Jacob. I'm going to need a little feedback on how it's going. And can you still hear me? Okay. This Jacob Schoonover, not to be confused with his son, the lawyer. This Jacob Schoonover was a farmer. He owned a mill. He owned a cotton gin. He was a miner for a period of time that he lived in California. He was a photographer. He was a store clerk and then the owner of a clerk. And he was elected circuit clerk of Randolph County and served for 6 years back in the 1870s. Now, his first wife, right here, is Martha. Now remember, Weir Schoonover's daughter's name Martha, so they see there, and her maiden name was Weir. So he got his name and his daughter's name from his mother, Martha Weir Schoonover. She had, I think, 4 of the Schoonover children, and then she sadly passed away early. And Jacob remarried over here Ella Bolin, B-O-L-E-N, not my Bolin, a different Bolin, B-O-L-E-N. Now, this is the last family we're going to talk about, but it is a kind of dynamite family. Okay, Ella was the son of Captain J.N. Bolin, who is buried in this cemetery in an unmarked grave. And he might be buried right here where we're standing.
Sorry.
His wife, who lived to be 103, Mary Caroline Albritton Bolin, is also in an unmarked grave, we think, although we may find her at some point in one of our, when we're researching another part. So she's probably right here too. Both of these people are very interesting. He referred to himself as Captain Bolin. Captain Bolin served as a captain in the Civil War, under General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, I mentioned unmarked graves. General Forrest is also in an unmarked grave because if you'll recall, they dug him up from that place in Memphis right by the river and they've taken him someplace else, so I don't know. But at any rate, Captain Bolin kept that name for a long, long time. Now, I want to read you, and I think Ann Carroll wrote this. This is about Captain Bolin. Captain Bolin was a native of Pennsylvania, where he was born in 1831. He came to Randolph County in 1865, that's right when the war ended, and is known as the editor of the Old Randolph Herald, which he published for many years. Bolin was a staunch Democrat, and being a Confederate soldier, he attained the rank of captain, a title which he wore for the remainder of his life. He is remembered as being of the old school weekly editors who feared no man when it came to publishing all the news that was fit to print. He was wild at what he would publish as opinions and funny as what he would publish as local news. And I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. He's possibly the best known editor of a newspaper who has lived in Randolph County except for L.F. Blankenship, who followed him and merged to become the Pocahontas Star-Herald. Now here's some examples of Bolin and what he would write. I'm going to need that other one. Okay. One time there was a fellow who every time he came into town, he stopped at the newspaper office and gave him a little tidbit of news just to get his name in the paper. So Captain Bolin started publishing it like this. John Doe made his usual visit to the Herald office while he was in town on Tuesday. And then another one, and this was in a regional newspaper or maybe the state newspaper, and it seems like it was something that was trying to recruit people to move to Pocahontas. And this is pretty funny. And so Bolin is quoted as saying, "In general, our citizens do much as in other towns. They work hard, they earn money, and as soon as they get that money, they spend it with exceedingly great relish. Some of the men folks drink liquor, that is, when it can be obtained. All of the women try their dead level best to look pretty, to get married, and as soon thereafter as circumstances permit, to go into the baby raising. All our women wear two-story bustles, gossip some, drink vinegar, chew gum, and wear fancy garters." And so this paper says, Captain Bolin seems pretty well posted, and if his town doesn't boom, it won't be his fault. And then the final one that he wrote that we thought was pretty funny is, he wrote, and this is in a personal or a local part of the paper, "We are sorry that a certain young lady has declared her intention of never speaking to us again. We'll give her chewing gum, we'll give her candy, we'll even take her love letters to her fellow for her, anything to get her to be friendly again. For we are particularly anxious to know what it is that we have done to offend her." So that's about Captain Bolin, and he must have been a real character. Yes?
His wife.
I get to his
Well,
wife.
it's taking you forever.
Oh, John Allen.
Let's speed up.
He's ready to eat. Come on.
Oh my God. Okay, one more thing. I want to tell you about his wife, Mary Carolyn Albritton. She lived to be 103 and she died in 1940. And the interesting thing about her is she is a cousin to Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States' wife. And the other thing interesting about Mrs. Bolin is that her great-grandfather was baptized by John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. And that concludes, I don't know where Ray Adams is, but that concludes our Five Rivers Historic Preservation Facebook Live, and I hope you really enjoyed it.
Ray!
We had Ray Adams that's going to be coming to tell you about the cemetery. He's one of the Masons that cares for it and makes it so beautiful, and talk to you about where to give donations and that sort of thing. But we'll put him on the next time. So anyway, that concludes it. Hope you all liked it all right, and I didn't bore you to death, like maybe John Allen might have been bored.
Bye.